Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion about extreme heat health and the adaptation strategies we can use here in the DC region and elsewhere to keep cities livable, even in the face of a warming climate. My name is Kate Jentoft-Her, and I am the engagement manager at Greater Washington. GGWash is a local media and advocacy nonprofit. We inform, engage, and influence the public and policymakers to advance racial, economic, and environmental justice in land use, transportation, and housing throughout Greater Washington. We're hosting this conversation today because rising temperatures pose a profound threat to the livability of cities and other developed spaces. In 2021, even with scientific consensus and international agreements in place, global CO2 emissions reached an all-time high. This means that this extremely hot summer, which set heat records across the globe, will probably be one of the cooler summers for the rest of our lives. It also means that to protect the health of residents, cities really need to be investing in adaptation strategies for climate change. It is my pleasure to introduce today's panelists who will explain the relationship between extreme heat in cities, climate change, and health, the ways that exclusionary design choices create racial health disparities in the US, and the adaptation strategies that cities and other developed places, especially here in the DC region, can use to keep people safe in the face of extreme heat. We are joined today by Mark Muscano, the Executive Director of Casey Trees, Aaron Gomez, Water Quality Associate at Anacostia Riverkeeper, Jeremy Hoffman, the David and Jane Cohn Scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia, and Ella Mendonça, the Health Equity Program Manager for Environment Equity at the Environment Equity and Justice Center at the Natural Resources Defense Council. I'm going to go ahead and just take a couple more minutes to introduce everyone in slightly more detail, and then we will go ahead and get started with this conversation. Mark Muscano has been the Executive Director of Casey Trees for 16 years. Mark works to ensure that Casey Trees and Washington, D.C. remain on track towards achieving D.C.'s 40% tree canopy goal through the execution of its mission to restore, enhance, and protect the tree canopy of our nation's capital. Prior to joining Casey Trees in 2006, Mark served as the National Director for the USDA Forest Service's Urban Forestry Program and as DC's Chief Forester under the Williams administration. Aaron Gomez is a recent graduate from George Washington University with her master's in public health and environmental health science and policy. She's passionate about environmental justice, urban environmental health research, and sustainability. She is currently the Water Quality Associate at the Anacostia Riverkeeper, where she coordinates the DC Citizen Science Water Quality Monitoring Program, as well as various green infrastructure projects. Dr. Jeremy Hoffman is the David and Jane Cohn Scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia and the affiliate faculty at the L. Douglas Wilder School and the Center for Environmental Studies at VCU. He connects audiences to their changing planet through participatory environmental research and interactive, hands-on, and immersive experiences, including recognition through his research and work. Earning recognition through his research and work, including an urban heat island assessment of Washington, D.C. in 2018. He's featured in the New York Times, National Geographic, the Washington Post, and of course, Greater Washington. Jeremy is also the chapter lead for the Southeast region in the 5th National Climate Assessment. Ella Mendonça is the Health Equity Program Manager at the NRDC Environment Equity and Justice Center. Previously, she led the SPARCC Health Equity Team and Community Practice, working directly with community-based organizations in Atlanta, Chicago, Denver, Memphis, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area on integrating health, climate, and racial equity. She serves on the American Public Health Association's Center for Climate Health and Equity Advisory Board and was a 2020 Bloomberg Fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. Before joining NRDC, Ella worked at the Council on Environmental Quality in the Obama administration. She's deeply passionate about understanding how climate impacts public health, specifically for low-income communities and communities of color. She's based at NRDC's DC office. So with that, I am going to go ahead and kick this discussion off, starting with Jeremy. Jeremy, can you talk a little bit about the urban heat island effect? Is it just an urban problem? And then how does it relate to climate change?
Thank you, Kate, and good afternoon, everyone that's attending this webinar. It's interesting. We tend to hear about extreme heat in sometimes in conflated ways, and I'd like to take a second to kind of introduce how urban heat islands and extreme heat in cities is an additive effect of two related but separate environmental phenomena occurring. So the first one is global climate change, which is brought on by burning fossil fuels, like hands down. For we've established this relationship for over 100 years. Very well understood effect of increasing the amount of CO2 or heat trapping gases in the atmosphere and its effect on warming up the global climate. Now, what that global climate change, that warming of the climate system does is, and has already done, is to load the dice of our weather events to make more frequent, more intense, and longer in duration heat waves more likely than they were in the past. So what global climate change does in the mid-Atlantic region where we live is to shift the likelihood of these more extreme heat waves to become more normal over time. So that's going on in the background. The thermostat is going up and they're being pushed towards more extremes when it comes to heat. So that's what's going on with climate change. Now, there's this other phenomenon that goes on in cities of all different sizes, which is basically just put into place by the physics of the built environment or where we live. Human settlements themselves actually change the weather independently of global climate change. So human built surfaces, things like asphalt, bricks, anything that we've built that's not what was there before in a more natural landscape, has the ability in some cases to absorb relatively more of the sun's energy than other natural surfaces and then re-emit it back into the air as heat throughout the afternoon and into the evening. And so what this does, and it's another phenomenon that we've known about for over 100 years, is it raises a city's overall temperature in relation to more rural outlying areas that have much fewer human settlements. It raises that temperature above those background rural temperatures. But even more interestingly, within a city, you can have a wide variety of the dominance of either more natural and shady kind of park-like places and very dominated by impervious surfaces, those asphalt surfaces. So even within a city, we see, like we did in the heat mapping project that we did in 2018 in Washington, D.C., 15, 20 degree Fahrenheit differences within the same city. So that's all brought on by this urban heat island effect. And then think about making climate change, making the extremes more extreme and more likely. You see how this is kind of an additive double whammy that really shows that cities themselves can have an increased and higher acute heat risk for the people that live in them. This is an issue for us because more people live in cities than anywhere else type of land use in the US already. And it's expected that, by mid-century, 60-70% of the human population will be in cities. So you have this kind of like increasing heat risk due to climate change. You have the built environment raising the thermostat even further, and you have more people being exposed to those conditions through time. So this is a very important thing for us to be talking about. And even more importantly, understanding where are the knobs that we can turn to both reduce climate change. And then even if climate change goes away, the urban heat island effect will still be there if we don't address the underlying physical reason for that phenomenon. So it requires both of those things. Bonus points if you have ways of doing both at the same time.
Thank you, Jeremy. And just like one clarifying question that I think we run into a lot of GGWash is, the urban heat island effect has this word urban in it. Does that mean that it's just something cities experience?
No, the urban heat island effect, just like the term urban sprawl, is like really not physically based. It's like what is true urbanity? And you can talk about kinds of land use types and those sorts of things, but anywhere that we've taken a natural landscape and shifted it to a human dominated landscape, you have this physical relationship of upsetting the energy balance with the sun. So even in small cities, we see this effect go on. We did a campaign here in Virginia last summer that revealed even in a smaller, more rural city like Farmville, Virginia, we can still have 10 to 15 degree differences from one side of town to the next. And so that shows that basically any type of area where we're, surrounding a new housing development on the kind of ex-urban edge of a city, if we're not taking into account this physical relationship between the types of building and geometry and green balance into account, we can artificially raise that temperature in the immediate vicinity. So this is not a only urban issue, but it does affect people that live in cities more acutely because there are just more people in those places. But no, the extreme heat is just as potentially dangerous in more rural areas, but for different ways, but they're related as well.
Great, thank you. Ella, I think my next question is for you. Why is extreme heat a public health concern? And what are the health impacts of long-term and short-term exposure to extreme heat?
That is a great question and what I'm really passionate about. So extreme heat is actually the deadliest weather event in the US, and it causes more fatalities than tornadoes, hurricanes, and floods annually. It feels weird to say that because it's just hot, right? It's a temperature. But it's a huge public health concern, and US average temperatures have been rising each year, as I think you mentioned. Extreme heat puts pressure on our bodies, which work best at a certain temperature, and it pushes our bodies beyond those limits. And I'll link the DC website on heat risk because I think they talk about it really well. We hear a lot about heat stroke, heat exhaustion, and dehydration. And there are really serious, and these are serious and sometimes fatal short-term exposure outcomes, but these make up actually a really small percentage of the heat risks that come from extreme and moderate heat. And we really rarely talk about some of the other severe physical health and mental health outcomes resulting from longer-term or repeated exposures. So individuals who are exposed to moderate or extreme heat over time can actually face higher risks of respiratory, neurological, and heart issues, as well as increased risks of cancer and death. So that's your brain, heart, and lungs. And similar to how extreme heat disproportionately impacts communities of color and low-income communities, health outcomes also tend to burden our most vulnerable, as well as those with chronic health conditions. So for people who give birth, there are higher risks of preterm birth and lower birth weights. And there are kind of depths towards almost the health inequities. Preterm births are more likely already among Black folk than white, and low birth rate is actually twice as likely. So we often think about heat in the daytime, but also, hot rooms, limited AC or cooling technology from poor housing stock can impact your sleep. Our minds and bodies need sleep to recover, and this can have its own supply of health issues. And as we get more hot days that we've noted, there are higher risks of injuries and deaths at work, particularly for outdoor workers. And Black and brown people are, again, more likely to work in industries exposed to heat, sometimes without a place to take a break and cool off. I'm sure folks have seen the USPS stories that are circulating right now. And in addition, emergency room visits actually tend to spike during extreme heat for both physical and mental health outcomes. And these aren't just the outcome of extreme heat. I think I've noted a couple times, it's actually just moderate heat, especially for days or weeks. Prolonged heat can be incredibly harmful to human health. And extreme heat is usually discussed as around above 90 degrees. And so extreme heat has gotten hotter and more dangerous in our lifetime because it has been exacerbated by climate, but also intentionally inequitable built climate and environment choices. So if you are 30 and you're born in DC, the year that you were born had 24 extreme heat days. But if you're 40, your birth year probably had 17 days. If you're 50, your birth year had 13 days. but now we have an average of 30 a year. And by the time you're 80, that could be 50 days or up to 72 days a year of extreme heat. And that data comes from the Climate Impact Lab.
Great, thank you. This is just sort of a follow-up question, but I wonder if any of you might want to jump in and just kind of explain what are cooling strategies. Like if you do get too hot, if you're exposed to heat, like what are some of the strategies we actually have right now to cool off?
One of the key things for acute heat risk and mitigation, and Ella put this really well, is that like there's a wide range of different risks, but when it comes directly to things like heat stroke, it's just about getting as cool as possible, as quickly as possible. Almost every single heat related illness and death was entirely preventable through taking on those sorts of mitigation measures, like providing a cool indoor space. Sometimes it's as easy as getting out of direct sunlight. You can see all around places where people are outside during heat extremes. Most of the time you see people congregating under the limited shade that might be in one particular place, as well as, some of the more innovative, cool things that I see in places like DC are things like splash parks or spray parks, where you actually get the cool water kind of on your face. Some other strategies for personal kind of mitigation techniques would be like carrying around, I actually do this when I go out to water the trees that we've planted around the city, is to actually have like a little rag that can stay cool. Like it's a kind of something almost like an ascot, extreme heat ascot that you can dip in some water and tie around your neck. You basically just want to keep your internal temperature from getting too elevated to then trigger things like dizziness and confusion, and then the more serious cascading impacts of extreme heat, like passing out and eventually succumbing to that. You really want to keep your internal body temperature as cool as possible.
Great.
I think those are really great points. And Ella also mentioned in the health effects that dehydration was a big factor as well. So staying hydrated would be another really big thing to think about when you're in extreme heat events and even moderate heat events, like she mentioned.
Awesome. Anyone else have anything else to add before I move on to the next question?
I'll just add that I think no one plans to be in extreme heat. We are always like, oh, okay, it's hot out, or, but actually to just keep in mind that with these increasing temperatures that are going on for longer, try to make more plans on what you're going to do if you do feel overcome by heat. So I think, Aaron, you were just mentioning, like, carry water, even if you don't think that, you might be at risk. That might actually be the day where, you're trapped outside and you just cannot get into any AC.
Thank you. All right, I think Ella, this one is coming to you. Extreme weather events disproportionately affect individuals with lower incomes and people of color. What does this look like in the case of extreme heat?
Another question I'm very excited about. So researchers at UC San Diego looked at about 1,000 counties that house around 300 million Americans and found that in 71% of those counties, people of color lived in neighborhoods with higher temperatures than their white neighbors. And in 76% of those counties, lower income people experienced hotter temperatures than wealthier ones. And this kind of, is amplified, it builds up. So if you're living in a neighborhood that is both a community of color and a low income neighborhood, this, tends to really be a burden. Often, these neighborhoods were invested in less or disinvested from and don't really have the infrastructures to support community cooling, like tree canopy, green spaces, affordable and accessible housing with cooling technology like shaded windows or AC, or even weatherized energy sources. Texas is a great example when they lost power last year during extreme heat. And people of color are also less likely to have access both to the affordable housing and accessible housing, but to healthcare infrastructure that they need to address heat impacts. There are huge health disparities that we've talked about on both racial and income lines in the health system. Outdoor workers, agricultural workers, mail and package carriers like USPS, pregnant folks, older folks, children, the unhoused, those with chronic health conditions, they also face higher risks as well. And I think one of the almost themes of this is heat, almost like climate, impacts those who are most marginalized and most vulnerable, right? So it's just an added burden on top of stressors that already exist.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add anything there?
A lot has already been said. This is Mark, but David Nowak, who is one of the preeminent researchers on tree canopy in the U.S. and internationally, published an article a while back. I can't really cite it right now off the top of my tongue, but essentially what he found was that when you look at redlined areas, they typically tend to be those that have higher levels of impervious surfaces, 40, 50, 60%, et cetera, and so forth. And so what you're going to find is, as Jeremy so well explained earlier, those are the surfaces that will absorb during the day and then emit heat. So there's really no break in the heat. It's just kind of a constant. And again, those tend to be the poor neighborhoods. Now, that's not always the case. Downtown DC, commercial business districts, and so on and so forth tend to be very highly paved over, a lot of asphalt surfaces, and so on and so forth. A lot of cities, you probably have heard, are now painting streets white to test. Out in California, they're doing a couple of these types of things. But by and large, to what Ella had mentioned, areas that have been redlined tend to have less green cover, certainly less tree canopy, and surfaces that exacerbate the problem for poor and disadvantaged communities.
Amazing. This leads me right into our next question, which is again, sort of for all of you, but how does our built environment contribute to extreme heat events? And Jeremy, I'd love for you to start with this one.
Well, yeah, I mean, as we said before, it's really the underlying materials of how we build places to live and settle as humans that exacerbates extreme heat. So as I described before, these human-built surfaces, especially if they're very dark, very dense, have very low reflectivity to the sun's incoming energy. So by having areas like entire streets, roads, networks of our built environment that are very dense, very dark, very absorptive to the sun's incoming energy, we actually raise the local temperature in those places. So particular neighborhoods, as mentioned, that might have a dominant kind of feature of these impervious surfaces have much higher temperatures within cities, and it is linked directly to urban planning decisions that have played out for generations. I mean, every single second of your daily life in a city or in a settlement anywhere in human habitation is the integrated impact and echo of decisions that were made a century, multiple centuries ago, playing out as your day-to-day life. Like, planning decisions are so central to this. And so that was actually, that NOAC paper was mentioned. They kind of cite our foundational work back in 2020 that assessed the urban heat island effect and tree canopy and land use types in these formerly redlined versus their non-redlined counterparts. And if you are unfamiliar with the idea of redlining, basically, really in a really quick way, it was actually a decision as part of the New Deal to try and stabilize the housing market by trying to effectively prioritize particular places for safety for investment. But this required assessors to go out and actually rate neighborhoods in about 250 cities nationwide that had about 40,000 people or more in them. And basically, what they were able to do or allowed to do is go and just assign grades, much like the grades you got in school, to particular neighborhoods. And that was supposed to be related to their safety for financial investment in the form of housing investment, like mortgages and mortgage insurance. but effectively it was based on the color of the skin or the immigrant status of the people living in those neighborhoods. So these red-lined areas were given a red outline on these maps, and basically, much like a stop sign, worked to stop the financial investment going into those places. So these places tended to be ethnically diverse or communities of color, in places in cities that weren't particularly Black and brown communities weren't particularly prevalent. It was communities that had not yet achieved whiteness standards at the time. So you see Irish and Ukrainian and kind of Eastern European immigrants, Asian immigrants getting these redlined grades more so than their non-redlined counterparts. And the privileged areas were almost entirely white, wealthy communities, and they remain that way today. Many studies have linked long-term financial and socioeconomic outcomes to this redlining designations. Our study in 2020 was the first one to really start to establish the nationwide pattern of formerly redlined areas being hotter, fewer trees, more pavement than their non-redline counterparts. Now there's been an explosion of research in this space, including the paper that Mark mentioned, as well as dozens that have started to link not only environmental outcomes and health outcomes, but other social outcomes like gun violence to these practices of urban planning decisions that were largely based on racial and ethnic considerations, more so than any objective way of assessing the likelihood of financial investment to succeed in particular neighborhoods.
Yeah, and without, you know, getting too depressed on this topic, to just say that the real difficult part to what Jeremy had mentioned is, you know, we are living in and a product of, you know, decisions that were made 100 years ago in land use planning. The classic case on the positive side is in Washington, D.C., where the public parking, which essentially is a building restriction line, almost everybody's front lawn in areas that are not commercially zoned, residential zones, whatever they happen to be, there's a pretty, you know, there's a wide swath or somewhat wide swath of green space that's actually owned by the city. And all that land, along with the national park system lands that were preserved during that time, make DC greener than most urban areas of our population density and size. However, in the areas that, you know, are redlined, whether it's, you know, DC and other places, you know, once the heat and once the pavement's laid, once the concrete's put down there, once the buildings are built, it's really hard to change them to go forward to make them greener, right? You know, I say this all the time, a tree's great, but what's really being lost is soil. And if you don't have soil, you don't have green. And if you don't have that soil, you don't have a tree. And that stuff, you know, those areas will stay hot for the long term. And one of the things we're doing at KC Trees is we're, you know, trying to preserve lands for canopy at this point, whether it's creating easements on areas that, you know, should not be built upon, floodplain areas and those kinds of things, or just creating easements for park spaces that, you know, they may be park spaces now, but they could be developed upon. And so creating easements within those urban areas. Crispus Attucks Park is a classic case. That was the first easement we took about 5-6 years ago. So anyway, it speaks to not just the impacts, but the challenges to change those areas. I just heard I'm getting a little long-winded here, I apologize. I just heard a news story the other day. I think it was in Florida, where they're purchasing up to 10,000 window air conditioning units, which is great. I mean, it's, you know, it's the here and now of trying to preserve people's lives and their health and all that. But to Jeremy's point, the downside there is, you know, you put in more air conditioning units and guess what? You know, you're contributing to climate change because you're burning all that fossil fuel. And this is happening in places like England where you never used to use air conditioners. So anyway, a couple more things to consider. Thank you.
Yeah, Mark, that's actually a great point. I mean, I think we've talked a lot about, you know, vulnerable communities, but with global climate change, places that have not been facing moderate or extreme heat in the past are now experiencing that for the first time. Like that's happening in Europe, where they didn't even have air conditioning. So it's like, now, how do we keep people safe? How do we let people, you know, exist, right? Because what can you do with heat And air conditioning, while it does add to, GHG emissions, at the same time, it saves lives, right? And so I think hopefully we'll talk about some of the ways we can keep people cool that are more sustainable, but also if you're, a low-income renter, AC saves lives. I would say don't feel guilty about that. Keep yourself safe, right? And I just there's one piece, Jeremy, that you brought up that was, I feel like we sometimes talk about redlining, and I think redlining has become a really hot topic. The FHA was created, the Federal Housing Administration was created in 1934. And that is kind of when so much of this went into practice, where, Black communities, Black family folk could not get mortgages, period. They were not allowed to, right, federally. So it's not like this happened and the way our communities are shaped is like, unfortunately, communities of color and low income, communities these were intentional decisions that were made at the federal level and then were pushed county by county through planning. And it's also why traditionally, like, planning can be a place where communities of color do not feel welcome, because historically they weren't. Mixed neighborhoods, immigrant neighborhoods, like anyone who was not white, and in some cases with racial housing covenants, even Christian, could not own a home in most areas and could absolutely not get a mortgage with the federal government, which traditionally was kind of the biggest wealth generation factor for most people in the United States over like the past 50, 60 years. If you wanted economic mobility, you needed to buy a home and then you needed to pass that home down. But that wasn't an option for people of color, and also, for a lot of low-income folks. And that's kind of why we've created these neighborhoods that are hotter, because we chose to make them hotter. We actively said, let's put trees in white neighborhoods. Let's put trees in wealthier neighborhoods. So the fact that we have this today should not be a shock. It's really just, to Mark's point, like, what are we going to do now? And like, how can we actually, I want to say, retake community planning to build communities that are actually beneficial for the people who live in them, particularly communities of color and particularly low-income community members. And I think, I'll let us go because I know we're stuck here.
Thank you so much, Alla. That's all really important. Jeremy, just one follow-up question for you. One of the things that I learned about, when I was doing research preparing for this webinar was that, like when I think about cooling strategies, the trees, rivers, like those are the first things that come to mind. But buildings actually can play an important role beyond just like being climate controlled spaces where there's air conditioning oftentimes. Can you talk a little bit about like the height width ratio and how that matters in urban design?
Sure. Yeah. There's, people almost, and I'm not at all saying that any one thing is necessarily like should be emphasized, but you hear a lot in the discourse, people hop to trees immediately when we're talking about these things. But when we're thinking about urban heat mitigation or effectively addressing the urban heat disparity that is in our cities, it's a ubiquitous feature. As Ella said, 70% of all counties in the United States, regardless of urbanity, show this exact same racial disparity and income disparity. So what can we do about it? There basically breaks down into like two main categories. And it's like actually physically turning down the thermostat in our cities, which is known as mitigation. And then there is, how do you address and prepare governance structures for responding to the acute heat risks of an especially hot event? So that's like, there is the systems approach, which is the management of it. And then there's the physical built environment approach, which is the things that trees kind of fall into this same, bucket. But so does urban form, or the way that we design our cities themselves can either amplify or dampen extreme heat. Now, let me tell you about one particular variable known as the height to width ratio of a particular street and the buildings adjacent to it. So if you can imagine a 4-lane or 6 or, 2 travel lane, 2 parking lane on each side of a street, so effectively 8-lane wide street. That is a huge car sewer that it is enormous, right? But hopefully there's at least some sort of pedestrian environment on either side, like a sidewalk, hopefully also a bike lane, whatever that may be. Now, if you can imagine on either side of that 8-lane drive, that there are 1-story buildings, and single family homes, or strip mall style 1-story buildings. That doesn't, in depending on the orientation of the street, either north south or east west, we can imagine it east west. That 1-story building doesn't cast a lot of shade towards the north side of that east west street, and so that has a very wide street to very low height. So the height to width ratio of that street would be very, very low. Now, if you have very tall buildings on a very narrow street, you get that shade cast across the entirety of that street surface. So you're effectively removing any of the incoming solar radiation from that entire environment, both lowering the air temperature and the surface temperatures at the same time. So we actually call this form or structure-based shading, and it is the most efficient form of shade for lowering the thermal experience in urban settings. This was part of a conclusion of a paper known as 50 Grades of Shade by Ariane Middle that appeared in the I think the Journal of Climate. I'll find it and put it in the chat. But structural shade is related to that height to width ratio. So we can actually effectively increase density along those more transit oriented kinds of passageways through our cities, and actually reduce the thermal experience in discomfort in those environments just by increasing density. That also promotes mixing of air and things like that. But I'm happy to just kind of leave that be. But you can tell I can talk about this for hours.
Thank you so much. My urban planning nerd always thinks that's really cool to think about. It's just like the multitude of solutions we have at our disposal. Mark, we are going to pivot to you to talk about trees. I think, someone earlier, I can't remember who said it best, but someone mentioned that like the best solutions are solutions that address urban heat and climate change at the same time. And trees are an amazing tool that we have at our disposal to try and do some of that heavy lifting. And so I was wondering if you could talk about the role that trees have in mitigating heat and heat exposure, and then also how they're beneficial to health. And then a couple follow-up questions for you as well, but start there.
Sure. Yeah. A pretty broad category. I'll try to dive in and hope I remain relevant. But I think a colleague of mine, I think, liked to set the stage for a lot of his talk. He said, before the Chesapeake Bay was completely developed, you could drink the water, you could do your business upstream, and if you were 10, 15 miles downstream and you drank the water, you'd be fine. And I think the same thing could be thought of in the city. You showed that climate map, and I think the best way to think about the impact of trees and green space on any urban heat island, and again, this is getting to the bifurcated, the changing climate and the urban heat island, as Jeremy had so well mentioned before. But in terms of the urban area itself, if you look at that map, the heat is not around Rock Creek Park, right? And so that's just an example in the extreme. If all of DC had that much canopy, it wouldn't be as hot as it is now. And that's the same thing for a lot of the areas throughout the country and the world. The difference is, being that, we're not exactly sure how trees impact the local area where they're at. A colleague of mine, Mike Alonso over at American University, remote sensing expert, is doing a lot of work on this right now. It's kind of fascinating, but we do know in the aggregate, and there's been a lot of these studies. In fact, we've done some with volunteers, is, you just take a temperature under a tree and then a temperature outside of that, and you see extreme differences. I mean, it's commonsensical insofar as the stuff is common sense. The other thing too that's kind of interesting is, and this talks to how shade helps infrastructure. We know that streets that are shaded by trees, the pavement life increases by, like, I don't know, some incredible amount, like 50%, 60%. Pavement normally would last, 17 years or 15 years. If there are trees shading it, it's going to last, 35 years or something along those lines. So we know that, trees have a significant positive beneficial impact on the cooling, but, and this is really kind of interesting. When people talk about trees, you get the whole spectrum. Most people like them. There are certain percentage people who just can't stand them. They hate them. Business owners tend to not like them because they block signs and that kind of stuff. We deal with this stuff all the time. We plant a lot of free trees on residential lots, and the first thing out of people's mouths is, oh, this eventually is going to grow so tall it could fall on my house. We have to say in a gentle fashion, well, it might impact your grandchild if they have your house. It's not going to impact you. Trees take a long time before they start shading streets. So this is not a quick impact thing. And there's a lot of, the recent act that just came out of Congress in terms of trees. That's more money that's ever been poured into urban tree planting ever. I used to manage that program that now is $1.5 billion for the next 9 years. We normally would distribute about $40 million to all the 5 states and 9 entities. And now that's going to go up quite significantly to the tune of about 3 million per state, which is still a drop in the bucket. I hate to tell you guys this. It's really not a lot of cash, but it will grease the wheels. And so things are going to happen because of that increase. Most states, instead of getting $3 million, would get about 150 grand, something like that, $100,000. Each state is supposed to match that. Most do not. That's a whole nother discussion about politics and all that kind of stuff. But trees do have a significant impact, but they also have an impact on the social emotional well-being of people. And that's kind of what I wanted to mention here. There are researchers trying to figure out dose response to this. Do people feel better around greener areas if there's 5%, 10%, 20%, 30%? We don't know what that holy grail is. We do know that trees have a significant environmental as well as economic benefit because of those environmental benefits that they provide, whether it's cooling or stormwater management and so forth. But the holy grail, which I'm not sure how long it's going to take to figure this out. These are far greater minds than I will ever be. It's way above my pay grade. But again, what is that dose response? We know in Europe that they're giving out scripts for people to, go out into green spaces for afflictions like anxiety. My wife travels a lot throughout the world, and about 15 years ago, she showed me a prescription from someone in, of course, Denmark, I think it was, where they were told to go out into the local park for a half an hour each day. And I marveled at this, and we've picked a lot of this stuff up here in this country. In fact, Dr. Czar, who's local, is doing similar things right now, and it's happening across the country. But we know trees have a positive benefit on our social and emotional well-being. I knew this a long time ago. I used to live in Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan doing tree stuff, believe it or not. And I didn't need a shrink to tell me that when I walked from my apartment in Hell's Kitchen on 47th Street into the south end of Central Park, I could feel it. I could feel the difference. It was like, oh, it's something all of us can palpably feel. And so the benefits of trees and green spaces are so broad and wide ranging. The question is, and will continue to be, how much? And we really don't know what that dose is. Casey Tree's goal to canopy 40% of DC's, to have 40% tree canopy. The 40% number has been bandied about for a real long time. How different jurisdictions come up with their canopy goal in the city, DC, of course, has its own canopy goal of 40%, is a little bit of an enigma. And it's kind of based on, things about how many trees can we plant and so on and so forth. In Washington, DC, we're very, very fortunate. The combined efforts of Casey Trees, Department of Transportation, and Department of the Environment, we're planting around, anywhere between 10 and 15,000 trees a year. That's more trees per capita or per square mile than pretty much any city in the United States. The bad news is that because development is just so intense right now, and we get into land use planning, right? We actually saw a drop in canopy over the past 5 years, even though we did increase before then. And so we lost a point of canopy for 70 square mile city is about 500 acres, give or take. The size of the National Mall is what we use as a comparison. The interesting news is where the plantings have been most intense, and my hat's off the DC Urban Forestry Administration on this, and not just because I used to work there, but tree canopy actually increased on the street sides because they've been planting so many for such a long period of time. But that takes constant and significant sustained efforts. And so, you know, a little bit of good news, bad news there, but you know, I also, as to my point earlier, you plant a tree now, it takes about, you know, 7 to 10 years for it to show up on a satellite image. We are planting a lot of trees, and they will start to show up over the next 5, 10, 15 years on these assessments that we do all the time. So I don't know if that answers all the questions, a lot of questions within what I've mentioned, but I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much. I have some follow-up questions, but I want to get to Erin, because rivers are such an important part of this solution as well. So Erin, basically the same question for you, but river style. What role do urban waterways have in mitigating heat and heat exposure in urban spaces, and how are they beneficial to health?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So it was kind of funny that Mark mentioned how there was when he took a measure underneath a tree in shade for temperature, and then outside there was a big difference. So we run a water quality program, and part of that is measuring air temperature and water temperature. And one of the things we do tell people is if there's shade, go take the air temperature closest to the water under the shade, because it's quite a bit cooler than above the dock or something like that. But anyway, I just thought that was interesting that you mentioned that, because that is something that we encourage our volunteers to do. But to get to your question, urban waterways do help mitigate heat and heat exposure in many ways, but one way is through actually absorbing the heat in the environment. And instead of impervious surfaces like asphalt, it doesn't radiate back. So it absorbs it, and it actually evaporates water into the air, which will cool the air around it. So that's one way that is really beneficial to the immediate surrounding areas. But another way that we can adapt to the extreme heat events is through access to actually use the water. So unfortunately, right now there is a ban on swimming in all DC waters, but we are working on making the Anacostia swimmable and fishable again. And it has gotten quite a bit better over the years through the help of many volunteers and staff cleaning it up, as well as the Clean Water Act. But having access to clean and healthy waterways is super important to many different community members, and the Anacostia specifically serves quite a bit of wards 7 and 8, and so those are wards that have a higher percentage of low-income communities as well as communities of color, and there actually have been evidence that people do want to wade in the waters. In Watts Branch, actually, part of our program of water quality monitoring is getting recreational use information, and so they have actually collected a couple data points where people have been waiting, so they want to do this, and so it's our job to make sure that they can do it safely and have access to clean and healthy water. So yeah, one of our goals is to be swimmable, and unfortunately we aren't there yet. We're working on it, and so what we're doing right now is collecting information. So we run this DC citizen science water quality monitoring program, where we actually have volunteers come out and take samples, as well as collect information on air and water temperatures, pH, things like that. But most importantly is bacteria levels. So people can't swim if there's high bacteria, and it's just not healthy for them. So we make sure that we have all of this data publicly available so that anyone can go look if they're planning on going kayaking or fishing or anything regarding the water. They can know immediately what the water level is like at that time. So it's really important that we make sure we keep the water healthy, because it offers a cooling space for people, hopefully in the future, to actually jump in and swim around. I'd love to see it. So hopefully it can offer that spot of cooling where people may not have access to air conditioning, as we mentioned. And it would just be great if we could get somewhere where people could just jump in and splash around if they can. But yeah, I hope that kind of answers your question. I know we have other questions in the Q&A, so I don't want to take up too much more time, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple about water, so we might circle back. I am so grateful for all of you for being here. This is such an interesting conversation. I know we didn't get through all of the questions I had prepared, but there's some really good questions in the Q&A that we want to get to. And so we'll try and get through as many of those as we can. And if there's time at the end, we'll circle back. And then folks, if you asked a question and it's not answered, we will try and answer it in the sort of follow-up email after the webinar. But we had a great question just about sort of data collection. Jeremy, this is probably the best question for you, but you sent us this heat map that was DC and had a little bit of Arlington. And we have a question about, is there a good data source to create a similar map for Arlington County? Is there already one that exists? And then how could someone do that?
Right. So there are a few different ways. Quickly, there are 3 different ways that you can assess an urban heat island effect. The first is using satellite remote sensing imagery, which is freely available from the Landsat program. You can go to the USGS Earth Explorer and actually extract a tile from the analysis ready data set for Landsat 8 via that portal. And you can get a surface temperature map. That is not directly related in every single way to the overlying air temperature. It has way more variance between different surfaces. You can imagine like the temperature of the asphalt's probably 150 degrees on a hot day. Air temperature is never going to get that high. So you can get those sorts of land surface temperature estimates fairly easily through that sort of approach. So that's from like the map side. Our methodology and map generation technique relies on a assessment campaign of actually going out with thermometers and driving around cities during a heat event, and then putting that into a model framework that relates to the underlying land uses, and then predicts temperatures where we didn't take them directly. So if you're interested in following up on that and potentially getting a mapping campaign in your city, you can apply for support. I'm going to put this into the chat through this heat.gov website. You can apply for support to get a heat mapping campaign in your city through that portal. But then the third way is just to rely on individual temperature sensors, like weather stations, one from outside of Arlington and one from inside. There are a variety of those sorts of things that are out there. The Weather Underground, like Weather Bug map, can show you how that temperature might vary between different places. But as far as Arlington specifically, no, we don't have a specific map for Arlington, but there are a variety of ways that you could go about doing that.
I feel like Jeremy is the heat data guy, but I'm maybe ashamed to admit at GGWash that I was an Arlingtonite for like 6 years. And I actually found the county was really open with its data, both on heat and tree canopy. And so I think you can actually reach out to them and they'll not only send you some data, but in my case, they sent me like previous reports. And that was incredibly helpful. So just putting that out there as well.
And actually, Arlington did a mapping campaign last summer, so that those data are available through that portal that I put into the chat.
Thank you. We got 2 questions that are sort of related, so I'll kind of ask them together. Is there any data that you know of about how many homes are without AC in the DC region and / people who can't afford AC? And then sort of a follow-up question is like, how soon can we expect to see like 105, 110 degree temperatures in DC or DC region?
I don't know about there was a American housing survey data set through the census that provides a rough estimate of prevalence of air conditioning. But that has a variety of caveats involved with it. And then you could do things like energy burden is one way to assess whether people have enough adaptive capacity in the form of socioeconomic freedom to actually turn those things on. So some sort of approach between those two things is a pretty good proxy for where you might have very low prevalence of air conditioning. But more specifically to the future temperatures thing is that climate models predicting or projecting what the future might look like are very coarse with respect to geography. And so we saw this play out in a very dramatic fashion last summer in Portland, Oregon, where, projections of future climate wouldn't put it at 118 degrees for a few more decades, potentially. So, but that's on average over, kind of monthly totals. It's not a weather forecast. So there is some concern that our climate models may be underestimating the potential for there to be these very dramatic extremes that play out in the more near term, like what we had last summer in the Pacific Northwest, which killed a bunch of people. So, I don't want to be a soothsayer and say that I know what the future is like. However, it is possible for us to have very sustained and dramatic sorts of high temperatures like that in a heat stress sense. Both the combination of air temperature and humidity, those are actually within reach now. It's not a future issue, actually.
I also kind of wanted to touch on something Jeremy mentioned about whether or not they can turn it on. So I don't unfortunately have the information on how many homes don't have AC, but I think it's something worth noting that it's a decision that people have to make whether or not they turn it on or how high or low they turn it on. Because if they're choosing to pay their utility bill over choosing groceries for the week or the month, then it is something that people have to balance. So it might not be necessarily that they don't have it, it's whether or not they can actually use it.
That's a great point, Erin. And I think there's, data that shows sleeping at over 80 degrees is like very harmful for your health, but is that less harmful than skipping a meal, right? Like those are the decisions people are making, especially with the increasing costs of rent and so many other things, and DC's housing stock as well.
Absolutely. We have 3 minutes left and some really good questions I don't think we're going to get to. So hopefully I'm going to follow up with panelists with specific questions that are targeted to you, and then hopefully we can get some answers to some of these questions for everyone after the webinar. But before we leave, I just want to ask this one question, sort of fun, but what is one thing that we haven't talked about? I want to hear from each of you. What's one thing we haven't talked about yet today that just really is important in this conversation that you want to share? And let's go back. Let's start with Erin.
Well, one thing I haven't quite mentioned yet is our green infrastructure work. And I think it ties into a lot of what Mark does with KC Trees. But we do things like put in rain gardens and things like that, which in turn does help the quality of water in our urban waterways. So that does in turn help the overall water quality in our water systems. But it also provides a place where we can maybe switch over from impervious surfaces like a parking lot and turn it into a rain garden, which would also beautify the area, and it could potentially bring in economic value. So it not only cleans the water and prevents stormwater from going into sewer systems and things like that, and in turn helping the quality, but it has a lot of cyclical benefits when you put in things like trees or rain gardens. And I think that is part of the conversation with heat as well. And just how it all ties in together. It's not like a one solution will fix the urban heat island effect or climate change. We've all talked about how we need to start breaking down those silos and working together to form broader and more precise, both together. So that's one thing that I think I was going to mention and didn't have a chance to. So I appreciate the question.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us. Mark, let's go to you next.
Hi. Yeah, I guess I did talk about this, but I think it bears worth emphasizing. At the end of the day, we're engaged in a kind of a societal battle. I don't want to get too exaggerated on this, but we're really battling for soil and for planning, and we have not, my perspective, I'm not a planner, I'm a professional forester, and I've been doing, management of programs like this for a long time. But for me, at the end of the day, if we cannot commit as a society to understanding that we need to live in areas that are not just concrete and asphalt, if we cannot make the decision that we need parks and green spaces, not just islands of parks and green spaces, but areas of green within the areas where we live. If we can't commit to that, if we are to be kind of waylaid by profits and by solely development, and thinking about things as crazy as this might sound, is how much square footage does somebody need to live? We're seeing expanses of green spaces being taken up by enormous homes that accommodate 1 or 2 people, as for example. If we can't do that, we're going to slowly lose this battle over urban heat. And we really need to think about how to plan for the future. Urban areas, there's more trees in urban areas now than there has been, but that's just because the amount of urban areas has increased dramatically. Within each urban area, the canopy is declining. Throughout the United States, every urban area is showing a decline, has shown a decline over the past 20 years. And so the trends are clear, just like they are for climate change. And each area is battling with the same things that we are here in DC, which is loss of green space for pervious surfaces, buildings, roadways, whatever they happen to be. And so anyway, from my perspective, that's probably the biggest challenge ahead of us.
Great, thank you. Ella?
I think one of the underlying things we talked about at the beginning was that communities have been left out of these planning decisions. And like Mark, what your name, like development, people have come in and really utilized what should be community land, like green spaces, especially in DC. These are shared areas that bring, mental, physical health benefits, community health benefits. And for me, the real call is that, like, not only do community members need to get engaged in these planning decisions, but planners and everyone making decisions about public space and residential and development space need to be working with the people who currently live in the community. We need more green space, but we also need to make sure we're not increasing green gentrification and pushing legacy residents out of DC, but that is actually possible. We have ways to do that. So, like, let's center the folks who are living in our communities and make sure that we're building something that's sustainable with long-term good decisions, not just short-term development. And yeah, I'll share some resources on that as well.
Awesome, thank you. And Jeremy?
I would just echo Ella here and just say, like, if we don't do what she's saying, then we run the risk of just recreating redlining just under a different guise.
Yes, absolutely. All right. We are running a little bit over, and I'm very grateful for everyone for staying that extra 5 minutes. We have prepared just, there's this graphic that we shared earlier, this DC heat island map, and then some resources that our panelists have shared over the course of the day, as well as some calls to action suggested by different panelists. I will share all of this stuff with everyone in our follow-up email, as well as answers to any questions that we didn't get to. And Joanna, can you switch to the contact slide just for a second? Great. And if you want to follow any of our amazing panelists on Twitter or just any of the organizations they represent, you can go ahead and do that. And then Mark, the only one we didn't have was Casey Trees. Does Casey Trees have a Twitter handle or anything that you would suggest folks follow?
We do. I will get it to you later.
Awesome. Great. And so we'll update these slides when we share them with that.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us. And And yeah, recording will be available on YouTube, ideally by the end of the week, but if not, definitely by Wednesday of next week. All right, thank you all.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
having me.